Thanks very much, everybody. My name's Tien. I'm here as a distinguished professor of practice at the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy, and also at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And I, like Grace, I served in the United States government as well. She was at Commerce, I was at Homeland Security. So I just want to say first, thanks to Dr. Milton Mueller and Dr. Kareem Farhat for inviting me here. But really, I think thanks to you and for what you've been doing since 2004, running this workshop on important evolution of technology and governance and things of that nature. It's really helpful, and I think obviously incredibly timely to do it on the governance of artificial intelligence. So with that, we have a really good panel today. We obviously have one person coming in remote, and then we have two in the room. Our title is the Geopolitics of the Governance of AI. As I looked through, I wasn't able to attend the workshop yesterday, and I only caught about half of the one. Very good panel that you guys just ran. Then I looked at all of the titles, the way they were formed, Kareem and Milton, and they were specific, hard-hitting questions. It framed it and it scoped. And then Milton and Kareem get on with me and they say, John, the panel we want you to moderate is the geopolitics of the governance of AI. And I said, that's pretty broad. You are literally giving us not just one ocean, but several oceans to boil. And so with that, I agreed to do this panel along with the three panelists, if we could have through the weekend to answer the question about the geopolitics of AI. So settle in and we'll take multiple breaks through Sunday night. No, look, in all seriousness, when we did sort of back off and say, how do you scope a title and a question framing about the geopolitics of the governance of AI? And ultimately, look, it came down to this. And not everybody will agree with me in this room necessarily, but when you say geopolitics these days, it really is a cheat code for U.S.-China relations, right? Is it a cheat code for U.S.-China competition in the best case? Well, in my perception, in the best case, or is it really a stalking horse and a representation of what could lie in the future, or maybe is already existing today, which is U.S.-China military enemies of each other, either by proxy or indirect. And obviously, we're not in direct we're in direct competition now for sure, but we're not in direct conflict with China. But is this something where AI could eventually take us? So we decided, as we scoped it out with my fellow panelists, or my panelists on this great panel, we said, let's focus on U.S.-China. There's so much more in geopolitics, and we can get into that during the Q&A. So what I thought we would do is we'll have each one of the panelists go in order, about 5 to 7 minutes. They'll sort of state sort of their framing around the geopolitics, but really it's around U.S.-China. And then I'll ask a couple questions as the moderator. Probably won't take the moderator's prerogative too much based on what Milton and Kareem told me. This is a pretty engaged group, and I just saw that. So then we'll have the last 20, maybe 25 minutes. Open the questions from the crowd online, or is it only in here in the room?
We can take online if there are.
Okay, online as well. So we'll go in order. We're actually going to start with John, Lindsay, then we'll move to Jason Lowe off here to my right, and Carmen Lucero coming in from Yale across the table here. John is in San Diego, and I guess not watching the Dodgers Mets, but who said money can't buy happiness, at least if you're Shohei Ohtani. So that was a dig on John, Lindsay, because when we had our scoping session, the Padres were dismantling our Atlanta Braves. So sorry about that, John, but at least you have better weather than us. John, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, when I wipe away my Padre tears, I open my eyes and see the beach, so it's not so bad. Okay. So I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person yesterday. I caught a couple of the conversations and the conversation this morning, which is really terrific. And Milton, I want to thank you for inviting me anyway, and compliment you for the fantastic coffee here at the conference. So I've only got a couple of minutes. I want to make 3 quick points. The first is that I'm old enough to have seen the Grateful Dead perform live. And like Milton, I look at these emerging AI topics and think back to John Perry Barlow and the Declaration of the Freedom of Cyberspace. And this feels familiar, right? So when I think about geopolitics, the AI conversation is a lot like the cyber conversation, which was a lot like the revolution in military affairs conversation. So we've been having these concerns about information technology reshaping geopolitics for quite a while. And, you know, TLDR, we usually find that geopolitics shapes technology in the way that you use it a lot more than the reverse. So number one, we've been here before. Number two, okay, so where have we been and where are we? And the second point I'd like to make is just sort of setting the general geopolitical context. And you know, it's popular to say in U.S. government documents, and this isn't wrong, that you know the current strategic environment is characterized as a combination of great power competition. I agree with John, cheat code, you know, U.S.-China rivalry, and dense economic interdependence. So networks, complexity, all of these things. And when you put these two together, this is not just Cold War 2.0, right? This is different in many important ways. The first is this is a multipolar environment where you have many of those powers, those poles, being nuclear armed, right? So while U.S.-China may organize thoughts, right, we're you know viscerally concerned about nuclear escalation in Ukraine. Israel-Iran dynamics. That's fundamentally a nuclear story, right? So the shadow of nuclear use and the reality of nuclear deterrence really does frame a lot of what we think about in the geopolitical environment. So when you're thinking AI, right, nuclear weapons still exist, they're still in the background, and the environment is more complex than it was in the Cold War. Number two, nuclear weapons don't end conflict. That should be obvious, Ukraine, Israel. But it does shape and often constrain the way that it's expressed. So we have a multipolar nuclear environment with persistent limited war. And I know if you're living in Gaza, it doesn't feel very limited, but Israel still could do a lot more. So we have, you know, kind of persistent patterns of limited conflict. A lot of that limited conflict involves emerging domains. So space, cyber, electronic warfare, quantum computing, perhaps. Certainly, artificial intelligence is what we're talking about. Drones and automation, you know, more broadly. So we do see this kind of injection of new domains, and that is often challenging because these new domains are often dual use. Okay. Cyber, it's based on the internet. AI, it's a commercial innovation. Space, you know, thanks to Elon Musk, is increasingly commercial as well. So these are dual use domains. And then I think that kind of gets us back to what I started with, that, you know, this is a densely globalized economic space. That's different than the Cold War, where you had globalization, but it was globalization within these ideological blocks, right? You didn't have a lot of trade across the Iron Curtain. But now, right, US and China are both major military rivals and trading partners, okay? And that's interesting, okay? And one of the things that kind of emerges out of that is that a lot of the conflict, that low intensity conflict that I was talking about, takes the shape of what I like to talk about as subversion or intelligence. And this is not outright fighting, but it's the use of espionage, counterintelligence, subversion, sabotage, right? That word cloud that sits around deception and dirty tricks, okay? And this kind of falls out of this gray zone where you're not in peace, but you're not in war. You want a way to compete while still maintaining the cooperative basis of trade. So, so in a quick, you know, sort of 5 minutes, I would say that's the geopolitical context of AI, which again has very little to do with AI. This is familiar. And then my third point is, okay, well, what does that mean for regulation, right? How does politics shape AI regulation? What's the geopolitics of AI regulation? And, you know, I was going to put a graph up here, but I'll just draw it in front of you, right? If you can kind of think about the kind of international versus domestic dimension, so international up here, domestic down here, right? Competition, geopolitical competition is taking place at the international level. So states are competing for power, firms are competing for global market share, but you're regulating at the domestic level. We've been having these interesting conversations today about, attempts to get, global and international coordination groups. We know that that's always challenging, right? At the end of the day, sovereign states are sovereign states, especially big ones that have, lots of military power. Like it's still an anarchic world, as much as we might wish it to be otherwise. So we have domestic regulators for international political and economic interactions, and therefore we have multiple forms of interaction that are interacting, multiple forms of regulation that are interacting. And then on the other axis, you could think over here on the left, right here are your economic priorities, and over here on the right, I think that's your right, would be your security priorities. And so, this kind of breaks up this space of up here, right, at the domestic economic level, right, you have a lot of policies that are focused on international competition. And in the US sense, that may be creating a rules-based, international order, again, cheat code for enabling US firms to dominate the marketplace. It also could be promoting national champions, but your goal is international economic competitiveness. And then down here, right, okay, whoa, there's all these market failures, safety problems, equity problems, privacy issues, right, that we need to regulate and deal with those market failures. So that's, sometimes the maybe, European Brussels center mass. Up here at the international level on the security side are a lot of national security concerns. So when we're thinking about CHIPS Act, when we're thinking about creating security justifications for banning certain technologies, right? That's up here, right? You've got a security motivation at the international level, but then security can also mean your domestic regime security, your internal counterintelligence issues, right? So this is sort of the China center of mass down here, right? And all of these interact. And it means that when we're talking about AI regulation, we're not just talking about one thing. We're certainly not just talking about the possibility of, AI superintelligence. Like Milton, I'm skeptical of that. Maybe it's a real thing, maybe not. But there are these other issues, right? AI competitiveness worldwide and innovation, right? Regulating all of the very real and manifest market failures of AI, security concerns because there are military applications of AI, and the export of domestic regime control to the international level. Okay, so again, these are not technology issues. They are 4 different policy areas which are in tension and tend to interact because of the tremendous interdependence that we have. So 3 points. We've been here before. Geopolitics is not just Cold War 2.0, and regulation is at least 4 different goals for AI that have nothing to do with AI. All right, I'll take a breath now.
Great, thanks very much, John. Yeah, you get a coffee break for sure. Jason's going to go up to the podium, so you won't see him, and hopefully you'll be able to see the slides, John, from wherever you're at. But Jason, coming to us from Washington, D.C., and you're going to take us, if John gave us a broad scene setter across and some really good theoretical and some great framing, Jason's going to take us a little bit more inside the borders of China itself.
Thanks, John, for the great introduction, and also John for very insightful context setting, and as well as a framework for us to think about this geopolitics of AI. So today I'm going to make 2 brief points about China and AI. So one is domestic, the other is international. First, I'm going to show you how decentralized the government adoption of AI in China is. The second is China's international bids for in using AI as a development tool for global leaderships. So firstly, China is, as many know, that is radically integrating AI technologies into its government's operations. So it's, as I adopt Dr. Mueller's view as seeing AI as a digital ecosystem where you got from stages early on from digitalization, then you get to informationization and e-government and digital transformation, and the latest stage is this AI-powered information systems. So through programs named like City Brains, Smart City, and digital governments and e-government government affairs cloud. So these are packaged comprehensive program solutions with integrated with this ensemble of AI related technologies that's being built into the city operations. And these are, for example, this is Shanghai Pudong, and this is in Beijing, and that's in Hangzhou. So these are leading cities where they got this AI-powered urban management centers. Then, but what is less known is that these systems are actually decentralized. So my fieldwork in China finds that it is the local governments who have almost the entire control during the process of from designing to selection to procurement to implementation, lastly, and to operations and maintenance of these AI programs. To give you one quick example, so this is the pandemic control health codes in China. So for such a national or an international health emergency crisis, you would think one will need a centralized control program. But in fact, we've been seeing all these. So each of these are one province. So and each province develops its own code systems, and they do not share data among each other. So and these are behind this. This is not just one example. This is behind this is this AI infrastructures in these localities that they have been doing for at least a decade or so. The central party media literally call this warring states and has been repeatedly calling for mutual recognition and sharing of data, but that did not happen throughout the entire pandemic. So if you also look at from the other side, who are supplying these technologies and program solutions to the government, we look at this is a 2022 digital government's industry map that's summarized by China Academy of Information and Communication Research. So these blue boxes are different categories of AI-related applications in governments, and these white boxes are each of these are one company. So two quick things. One is besides the major national telecom companies, many of these, the majority of these suppliers are in fact private. Second, we don't see any sign or evidence of a centrally planned supplying a regime in this era. So in fact, we see local governments and the central governments are going on different opposite directions when interacting with some of the leading AI firms, including Alibaba Cloud and Tencent Cloud. All this leads to the second aspect in this decentralized AI governments. So not only is the government adoption of AI within its own operations, but also the government supported and initiated AI investments and also local developments. So these are also done primarily through local governments, and they have more initiative where it's vastly different across regions. So this has different several has implications on different levels. And for analytical framework in China studies, and when we need to understand digital governance in China, so I propose that we can move from the previous monolithic states framework to a non-monolithic state where we separate central government from local governments, and we look at what types of companies in the digital governance space that these different levels of government interact. For example, for these social media and platform companies, it's when their services mostly interact with national population, and it's regulated heavily and dealt directly with central government agencies, but for local populations and for these AI and cloud computing companies, where their major tasks are helping local governments building surveillance and digital government affairs regimes. So these are mostly interacting with local governments and serve their individual local populations. So the takeaway here for my first point is if we are familiar with this digital Leviathan narrative that's coming out from the surveillance capitalism notion, where we are not observing one centralized singular digital Leviathan emerging in Beijing, exerting control over the entire nation or pushing developments of AI in China. Instead, we are observing the collection or a multitude of localized digital Leviathans distributed across different regions of China. So that's my point number one. My second point is instead of a mature research, but a more like a research node or observation that look at the international use of AI by the Chinese regime. So during my talks, interviews with people in China and experts there, so there is a Chinese government-backed view that the United States is promoting AI development at home while strengthening AI security risks internationally. So in contrast, China is arguing and seeing AI as the newest addition to its development toolbox, where it can lead and through supporting developing countries. So for one most recent example, so the foreign minister and head of international affairs within of the Communist Party of China, Wang Yi, stressed that China supports all these things, and importantly, the strengthening of international cooperation on AI capacity building. And such capacity building is for good and for all, and it's for the sound and orderly, fair, and inclusive development of AI. So the emphasis is really on such to reduce the digital and intelligence gaps that's being widened because of the AI advancement. So that's the Chinese government view. So this has implications. Number one, for China's continued and the US-China strategic competition now moves into this AI space, where we might be seeing countries are grouping into two camps. So one surrounding China and the other surrounding the US. And secondly, because China is, I'll say it's prepared to it just started doing this AI developments projects, initiatives with Africa, Southeast Asian, and Latin American countries, where it's basically exporting these domestic governance models we've seen in point one to these countries. So, and this is without much of the security standards or framework in regulation. So this may also pose diffusion risks for AI technologies. So I stop here. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks very much, Jason. Jason, we're going to be moving here to Karmen here in a second. I will say, two things on your excellent presentation. Number one, great use of AI, obviously, ChatGPT-4, not a hallucination, because it is indicative of your 19-month field work, which is impressive in itself, in the volume and the commitment to it. But it's a great diagram, or it's a great piece of artwork. The other thing that I really thought was interesting, and I didn't realize you're going to bring up Wang Yi's presentation at UNGA, the UN General Assembly last month, is at least one thing that AI has done so far. It will be like a nanosecond before it's overtaken by competition, maybe, military competition, is you now have a race to the top, the moral top, if you want to say that, between the China and US, and saying, who should be the better global power here to be spreading the usefulness of AI to the developing world. So we'll take that as a win, but it's probably tenuous at best. So we were broad with John, inside China, non-monolith as it appears, according to Jason, and Karmen's going to help sort of let us see it from both sides in the competition. So Karmen, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So as John just said, I'm going to try and combine both themes. So the sort of geopolitical competition, as well as the specifics about China that Jason just described. And so first, I will start by reiterating Jason's point. I think the stereotype about China is that it's monolithic, highly centralized, and highly hierarchical. It's certainly hierarchical. Its government is formally centralized, but one of the key reasons it's so distributed, as Jason described, is because it's so big. And so even to the extent that a leader wants to centralize everything, they have to delegate. And delegate both vertically in the sense of delegating down to say the provincial level or local level, but then also increasingly in the tech space horizontally. So delegating governance projects to the tech companies and other large private entities themselves. So with that, I'll dig a little bit more into how this dynamic sort of affects the AI space and how the government plays a role in, I guess you could call it, industrial policy in the AI space. So first, there is national or central government investment in AI, both through national plans and policies. So the most well-known is the 2017 National AI Plan that sort of ordered the coordination of resources and investment in AI. And like the United States and other countries, one of the primary sort of functions of these is a signal, as it signals to local governments, it signals to society more broadly that this is something the Chinese government cares about and something that the Chinese government will reward for doing well. And so if you're an ambitious local official, it is good for you if you're able to, create investment or create innovation and growth on this subject in your locality or in your jurisdiction. There's also centralized funding. A lot of it used to happen through the Ministry of Science and Technology, but after a recent restructuring, a lot of it's happening from others. There's a very good report that was just published this week by Georgetown's CSET on the Chinese Academy of Sciences and how they invest about $8.8 billion US, or about 30% of China's basic R&D budget across multiple different institutions. I think it's a good example of both sort of the centralized signaling as well as the local actual implementation that, again, sort of under, this paradigm that I think is important for China. Another factor is a lot of the most famous universities, particularly ones working on AI, are national level organizations. So Tsinghua University is a national, it's in Beijing, but its status in the political hierarchy is a national institution. And a lot of these technology plans are focused on technological development, even at the expense of potentially other normative goals, including, say, economic fairness or, say, environmental impact. And even 10 plus years ago, there was already an important emphasis on self-sufficiency, but there's been a growing emphasis on self-sufficiency in a lot of these documents after the United States has engaged in using export controls and other tools that China definitely perceives as trying to limit its development. But as Jason described, I would say most of the investment or innovation or industrial policy in practice happens at the provincial and local level. So this happens both directly, and that local governments will just directly give money to institutions or to state-owned enterprises that then invest in private companies. But then there's also a lot of indirect support and indirect investment. So this comes in the form of infrastructure development, both like traditional or hard. So like, if you have a place that's easier to get from point A to point B because of nice modern infrastructure. But then in the AI space, you'll be seeing more and more soft or digital infrastructure investment in China. And so local governments investing in, say, public data sets or public models that are available. to private companies to use. So a key example is the Shanghai city government has an AI research lab, and that AI research lab has a foundation model that is for public use, specifically focused on autonomous vehicles. And so that's again an example of this kind of investment. Aside from infrastructure, local governments will have tools like tax incentives and directed local financing. So what I mean by that is it won't necessarily be the government itself giving the money, but they'll tell local banks, like, you should invest in this company, or you should give priority to this industry, for example. And then lastly, a lot of localities support industries in their jurisdictions and compete with other jurisdictions through the synergies in their local ecosystem. So a city like Shanghai is a financial center, it's a lot of money. They also have a lot of cutting edge universities. And so they will coordinate amongst these different institutions to promote innovation and generally do a pretty good job. When it comes to the strengths of this approach to industrial policy, there's a couple. One is the competition is very intense, and I think it promotes a great deal of risk taking. And so that's why you can see a lot of transformations from nothing to China being one of the global leaders seemingly overnight or in a very short period of time. You also have companies that aren't afraid to completely just try something else. So one of the things that surprised me when I visited a World Internet Conference in Wuzhen before the pandemic was companies that were not tech companies at all deciding to build CPUs all of a sudden or build foundation models. And on the one hand, this seems really silly, like you don't have the expertise, et cetera. But on the other hand, if you have, say, 100 companies that are doing that and 10 of them succeed and 5 of them succeed very well, then you have, a leading global edge industry. It also allows for a good deal of vertical integration. So this is, I think, also a big contrast with US industrial policy, where companies aren't afraid to invest in every level of the value chain because they have the support of local government to do so. Weaknesses include, as the example I just gave, is waste. You'll have a lot of just wasted resources. Corruption. A lot of this money doesn't go to the purpose it's supposed to. Overcapacity, and so it produces more than the Chinese economy can absorb, both because it just produces too much sort of in raw numbers, but also because a lot of what local governments do is take wealth from the household sector or from consumers to invest in building things and in industrial policy. And so that means that local consumers can't buy things, and so they need to export. And are just, I think over time, local governments, especially nowadays in China, are just losing the capacity to fund a lot of this stuff and may face a very systemic problem in the medium to long term. Another is environmental devastation. So in a lot of places, especially say like where a lot of steel manufacturing or other really intense industrial processes have happened, the environment has been completely destroyed. And then in the reign of Xi Jinping, there's been more sort of ideological pressure. I think for the most part, again, since Deng Xiaoping in the Open Up and Reform movement, one of the key advantages is you've seen a lot of competition, and some of the ideological push from Xi Jinping is pushing down on that. I'll real quickly talk about just broader AI competition before stopping, because I know my time is limited. So again, I think some of China's strengths is you do have broad public investment and you do have very diverse public investment, so it allows for a lot of competition. There's a lot of support of open source. You have a very dynamic and adaptive private ecosystem. And so it looks a lot like the US. Then you have big incumbents, you have new upstarts, and you have also in the open source space, you have open source models supported by large companies, but then also smaller companies that are entering the space with a great deal of energy and innovation. Some of the weaknesses include very onerous domestic regulations around content controls that apply at the front end. So in terms of data and inputs that go into models, and in terms of the outputs. So again, like output, like content. And that contrasts, it makes China's sort of international push on AI governance a bit contradictory. In that, as Jason said, they want to tout this narrative of we're pro-development, but their own regulatory approach to AI can be quite stringent at times. And so in the discussion, to the extent folks are interested, I can get a little bit more into China's engagement in international dialogues, both in the military and in the AI safety space, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Carmen, very well. So I'm going to do at least one more question. I think I'm going to go in the same order just for the sake of my panelists, so you know it's coming. John, Jason, and Carmen. If we go to the third question around weaponization, Carmen, I'll start with you. You know, a lot of great points there, and especially the way China is developing and thinking about these things. And I know we've been very China-centric and China-focused here. You know, there's a lot of folks out there, you know, to include those folks at UNGA who probably weren't quite trusting of China, despite what they said. But there's also a lot of distrust of the United States, or, you know, which camps are folks going to join? Obviously, I'm US-centric here. I think we're probably trustworthy, but we may not be trustworthy, but we are at least pretty transparent, as fragmented as we are. And certainly the United States of America can't be seen as a monolith either, because no matter how many government panels and things that Grace spoke about before that Sam Altman joins, I think primarily he's doing it to get inside the tent and know what I'll put in little E enemy quotes he's doing. So with that, you know, how do we, John, starting with you, how do we navigate the distrust, and it depends on who's distrusting, that we have with China right now? Are we in a race to the bottom in terms of having any kind of bilateral cooperation? And you don't have to answer this part, but I did go to a Council on Foreign Relations event here at our own Georgia Tech last night, and there was some talk around nuclear non-proliferation, things of that nature. Not as a comparative point to AI, but Milton, whenever I hear you talk about this, it's like, we've seen this before. One of you guys, John, said it, RMA, cybersecurity. Is AI sort of the next turn of that? I mean, you know, some of the best global cooperation that's ever happened around governance came out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, you know, we don't want that. We don't want AI to produce something like that. But are we in a race to the bottom? How do we deal with navigating the distrust of China, and to some extent the uncertainty of how the United States is going to approach AI and generative AI, possibly AGI? John?
Yeah, great, thanks. Let me just pick up, actually, John, on that last.
We can hear it.
Good?
Yeah, okay. Start talking.
Let me just pick up on that last analogy, because I think it's useful as a stark contrast to the AI and cyber space. The cooperation in nuclear weapons, right, is based on this kind of more fundamental cooperation that underlines deterrence strategy in general, right? I mean, deterrence works because there's a mutual interest in not incinerating the planet. You know, Thomas Schelling's very clear about this, right? This is the difference between war and deterrence. War is a pure contest of strength, no cooperation required. Deterrence is about getting to yes, right? And then, you know, then shaping what that bargaining space actually looks like. So there's kind of like underlying kind of common interest in making sure we do that, but it's common interest in how states use their independent nuclear arsenals. At the end of the day, like, that's why it's so frightening, right? You have a complete kind of autonomous command and control system. You can use these weapons. You can threaten to do that. You always have that outside option. That's kind of the logic of deterrence. And AI and cyber, and I'll group them together, because while there are a couple of differences that maybe we'll get to in the next question, they're both about information infrastructures. Information infrastructures also have this underlying logic of cooperation, but it's different than deterrence, because you're actually building the entire space, right? If you don't have data, if you don't have, you know, computing infrastructures, if you don't have, you know, transnational companies to kind of do the innovation, you don't have AI in order to abuse and then, you know, mobilize for espionage and subversion and sabotage and all those things. So it's not just that you need to cooperate to kind of tamp down the intensity of AI cyber-enabled security competition. It's that cooperation actually is the fundamental condition to make all of it happen. And I think that that is an important kind of fundamental constraint on the intensity of a lot of these interactions, right? You want to have common trade relationships, common infrastructural relationship, because it's good for prosperity, it's good for trade, and it also enables intelligence competition. Okay, so if you want to continue to have trade in the future, you want to continue to have opportunities for intelligence exploitation in the future, you need to maintain those relationships. So there's kind of this paradox here when we're thinking about information technology enabled competition. It is predicated on a fundamental form of cooperation in a way that kind of pure traditional military security competition is not. And that means perversely, right, that competition in this space, intelligence exploitation, while we don't like it, disinformation campaigns, why we don't like them, are actually symptomatic of kind of fundamental incentives for cooperation that create that domain in the first place. I like to say that I'd always rather have a cyber war than a real war. Real wars are horrific and terrible and costly. Cyber war, you know, is not a thing, but if it were a thing, it's annoying, difficult, frustrating. It can impact your bottom line. It can transfer intellectual property with a whole lot of extra work. But at the end of the day, it is this intermediate form of competition. And so we got to think about when you're in the gray zone, right? It's glass half full, glass half empty. And the half empty is, oh my gosh, I don't like that we have all of these Chinese threat actors that are now using AI to supercharge their disinformation campaigns, enable their espionage targeting. But at the same time, right, glass half empty, like when they are doing that, they're blowing off steam. They're learning about what actual interests are. We're learning about what their interests are. And that can actually improve information and ironically improve stability. So I actually think that when you're kind of thinking about lesser of two evils, right, actually maintaining cooperative links and engagement with China is actually a good thing, not just because it promotes, you know, good old liberal international, you know, interdependence, which, you know, may or may not be a good thing for moderating Chinese behavior, but it provides this additional arena for gray zone competition, which actually is an important pressure release valve in international politics.
Could I do a quick follow-up on that? So, John, the thing that we didn't hear from Karmen and Jason was all of the decoupling stuff that's going on specifically in the digital sector. So there's an implication of what you're saying that if we do decouple, the alternative becomes the real war rather than cyber war.
I do think that that is a risk. I'm not a fan of decoupling. I think we want to have China dependent on the West as much as possible. That provides leverage. If you lose that leverage, right, you're going to lose, you know, incentives to cooperate, and you're also going to lose all kinds of intelligence access and information about what China is doing. I mean, that goes both ways, right? I mean, like we have big public conversations about how China is exploiting the U.S. We don't talk about how that same interdependence like enables situational awareness about what China is doing, and that's important. So yes, I think that decoupling is risky because it pushes us more towards anarchy, and when you're in anarchy, like the risks of bargaining failure of war go up.
Glass half full and a realist. Thanks, John. Jason.
Yeah, I second John on this very important point of having cooperation mindset on these information infrastructures, especially given this is the nature of a gray zone competition. Let me just briefly, very briefly say that on AI and cyber topics, this is actually one of the very few remaining issues or topics that the US and China are still talking about and have the potential for some level of cooperation. Given my research and my focus for the presentation, I would suggest the possibilities of talking to local level governments and also talking to leading AI firms in China, particularly given that we are seeing that in China, this is with the local initiatives and dynamics, this is sort of AI tournament game happening at local level where localities are getting rewarded for their developments on AI. So these local officials might get promoted because of their such their efforts on AI. So the previous round for the for 2 decades was GDP tournaments. So now we might be seeing these AI tournaments. So given their incentives and as well as on the local level, there are also less ideological constraints. So I think there will be room. So let me stop there.
All right, great, thanks. Carmen, same question.
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly agree that dialogue is important. I will say that like dialogue's not going to solve all the problems, of course, like not. I think both the United States and China in particular are going to continue to develop these technologies and like a set of rules, new ones, existing ones, et cetera, aren't going to stop China, for example, from doing everything they can, including developing new technologies to be able to take Taiwan and defeat the United States in a context in which they think there'd be a conflict over that with the United States. That being said, I think there is, as they said, great values to dialogue. So one is, I think both US and China have an interest in sort of non-proliferation issues. So to the extent that China's, secretly working on developing cutting edge AI in a military context, they don't necessarily want North Korea doing the same thing. And same with the United States. When it comes to the decoupling issue, I think there's arguments on both sides. I also think that decoupling is sort of a fact, like there is a process of ongoing decoupling. I think complete decoupling is impossible given just the way the globalized economic system works, but there's a sort of bipartisan consensus of some level of decoupling. And just on the point about whether or not it leads to conflict, I also think there's a bit of a debate in terms of whether it does or not. Because one, I know that historians will cite, or 2 examples. One is the Great Britain and Germany were very economically integrated before World War I, and that didn't stop them from fighting. If anything, it created a greater sense of insecurity over mutual interdependencies. Whereas the Soviet Union and the United States are, of course, not economically intertwined, at all, with a few minor exceptions, and a Cold War never came to a hot war. Again, in part because I think there was a certain level of security in both countries. I will say also on the point of dialogues that there are a number of ongoing track 2s on AI governance between the US and China. There's, of course, the official track 1, the first of which happened in May. A second one is in the planning stages now. But then in conjunction with that, there are a ton of track 2s organized by think tanks. The China Center at Yale Law School organizes some. So there are a number of ongoing discussions around AI, and I think these serve 2 very important purposes. One is they get at complex issues. So even to the extent that US and China fundamentally agree on an issue, a track 1 dialogue is too short or too small of a forum in order to get into the level of detail that you need to really have effective regulation, little implementation on an issue. And then the second is sort of speaking to Jason and John's point that to the extent that the governments are not in agreement or not talking to each other about issues, track 2s allow for that kind of engagement, whether it's between academic experts, technical experts, et cetera.
Great, thank you. You're going to start here on the 3rd question. I will say, and again, hats off to Kareem and Milton, this is not a track 2 dialogue necessarily, but it could lead to it in your sort of follow-up. And the incredible role that academic institutions play in giving more, I would call, mental negotiating space between major powers. So the United States government, I'm not sure if Grace would, I don't know if Grace agrees with me as necessarily, but I know that when I was in the US government, I really appreciated that there were track 2 opportunities out there, because it takes some of the heat and the pressure off of, Tony Blinken going to Beijing. So when he does, or in Northern California a couple of years ago. So the last question is really, and Carmen, we'll start with you, then go to Jason and John. That was, we put the more hopeful question in the middle, and we're putting the less hopeful question in the end, which is the reality question, which is, what is the Department of Defense, we'll be very tactical there, what is the Department of Defense most worried about that China's developing from a military capacity with AI, leveraging it? And then the converse, what is China? And, you guys, all 3 of you may have the exact same answers, but unfortunately the field is pretty open here. So Carmen, over to you.
So my understanding is that both sides are effectively most concerned about the extent to which AI leads to unpredictability, and that unpredictability then leads to uncontrollable escalation. And so, for example, China does have an official policy and statement on the regulation of lethal autonomous weapons that it presented to the government group of experts at the UN in 2018, I believe. And the policy has been widely criticized in the US government as being, like, their definition of autonomy is so broad that it essentially is only incorporates technology that does not exist or is not realistically deployable. And two, that it only applies to the use of that technology, but not to the development or sale of that technology. And this is, of course, in the context in which China is selling a lot of its drones and other developments to other countries, including, Iran, Russia, et cetera. And so I think there's a great deal of sort of mutual suspicion on both sides about the extent to which they can't, they don't believe what the other's saying in terms of what's being developed, and that will lead to an incident in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait that allows for a kind of escalation that neither side necessarily wanted. And so track twos are actually, I think, a good supplement to some of these discussions, because they don't necessarily help answer these questions. No one's going to tell China what's happening in the DoD and vice versa, but they do at least develop relationships and help folks in both sides know who to call to the extent that there is an issue, and to think about different decisions and different actions in maybe a different context than they would absent that knowledge.
Great, thanks very much. And Jason, you have to take the question wherever you want if you want to look from the China.
Yeah, so I have less expertise on this question, but I would just note from my field work that when I talk to researchers and experts on POA, so they painted me the picture that within the military, the information systems are also highly siloed. There are legacy systems, and also there are a lot of reluctance and sometimes resistance to share data among across different parts of the military. So that means for any sort of, and they are also very highly aware of the risks and also the associated responsibilities once they integrate AI and also the data and centralize, localize this. The localized central regimes within the military. So so that probably means that any integration within the information system within the military for the information systems leads to a strong push from the top within the POA. I just know this one.
Great, thanks very much, John.
Great, thanks. Just real quick, Karmen, I can't resist. We're going to talk about interdependence in World War I. If you look at the series of crises that go on, like interdependent nations actually don't start the crises resolve, and then the war starts in the least interdependent core, and then through alliance relationships spills over, and then in Cold War you have nuclear weapons, which kind of swamps everything. So super nerdy classic discussion, but I think it's relevant now. As far as this particular topic, I would say that both countries, China and the United States, are thinking about military AI in the same way, and I think they're making a basic mistake in the way that they think about it, which is focusing on AI as a substitute for what human beings do. So you focus on how can AI replace human warriors on the battlefield or human machines in the sky, and that leads to the discussion of lethal autonomous weapon systems and swarms and all of these things. And yet, where you look at actual trends and adoptions, right, it tends to be logistics, intelligence, administration, right? A lot of these kind of back-end support activities, quite frankly, look a lot more like civilian organizations, right? That's where AI is mattering. And it's mattering because AI is not a pure substitute for what human beings do. It makes prediction, a very particular task, more efficient and less expensive because of compute and all this. But that means that data and judgment, your objective functions, right, become much more important. And that means that within a military organization, the institutions and the politics of getting a hold of information, managing your information infrastructure, figuring out what you want to do with these systems become more important. And that means that like the organizational implementation of AI systems become very, very complex because of the complements of AI. Now, what does that mean for kind of the relative balance here? It's troubling because, right, the United States has a lot of experience implementing information systems in war. China has a lot of investment, not a lot of experience. So we don't have a real good understanding of how AI, when you think about it as a substitute, but it's actually a complement, is actually going to translate into the ability for the PLA to perform on the battlefield. And if that ends up creating a lot of uncertainty, then that creates escalatory risks that are slightly different than what Karmen talked about, right? It's not that the autonomous bots are going to be given too much control and they're going to make decisions and they're going to do things that we can't control. That's a story of substitutes, right? The story of complements is we can't actually measure the balance of power because we don't understand how well organizations are able to internalize and implement AI systems. And if we can't figure out who's got the relative advantage and what they're doing, then we start to make miscalculations in crises, right? That could potentially lead to escalation. So I think Karmen and I end up agreeing that there is some real escalatory potential, but I think the mechanism is that AI, because it is an organizational complement rather than a substitute, right, creates a lot of uncertainty in the net assessment of military power. So I'll.
Super helpful, John. Karmen, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I actually don't, I think we are even more in agreement than you just said. I don't think the risk is autonomous weapons making decisions that the commanders or the people in the field don't want. I think my understanding is the same as yours, which is that it's about the system as a whole.
Yeah.
And that's again why the track twos are so valuable. It's because it helps put decision making in context and it helps folks understand. You're not going to learn what the tech is. They're not going to tell you, but you will learn more about the contextual thinking of how they're approaching different issues. And again, to the extent that there's something going wrong, again, you're not going to know what kind of tech they're going to deploy, but you will know who can I talk to about this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a huge thing that Track 2 can do is just make sure that the cross-domain issues are well understood on each side, right? We can't just talk about AI because any militarized interaction with China is a nuclear interaction as well.
Getting the expertise on the table. So we've got 5 minutes left. There's nowhere near enough time for the questions and for each one of the panelists to respond. Otherwise, my prediction was true, which is we'll go to Sunday night. So what I think what we'll do is we'll have each of the people have their place cards up. Looks like 5. You get 30 seconds to make a comment or a question, and then we'll close with the panelists having whatever they want to say. They can answer a question or they have a closing comment. We'll start with Devin to my left.
So, as everyone knows, the notion of uncoupling and all is great, but I would say, why do we assume China actually cares, right? And Russia's the problem here. It feels a little too much like the Fukuyama claim that if we just trade, we get along, but that's being shown to be less and less. And that's my, hopefully less than 30 seconds.
Helpful.
Thanks. It's more of a question. I was very curious about sort of how China is viewing and the US is supposed towards energy policy in relation to the advancement of AI. We're aware that we're seeing a surge of activity private companies starting up Green Mountain Island and nuclear reactors and other missions. Obviously, energy policy is a huge driver for national relations. Aware that also water dependencies are a huge issue right now. I think everyone agrees that energy and water seem to be the major bottlenecks for advanced AI development. So curious how those countries are thinking about this, if at all, yet, and can you guys scale up and crucially, how that might affect some of these decoupling approaches.
It could be a limiting factor on compute power and data centers, which is in this building too.
So hi, my question is for Jason. Jason, you mentioned that China is looking at the UN as a forum for regulation of AI. And I'm kind of curious as to why do you think that is? Because whether it's platform governance or, other kind of technical governance, UN has not really been at the forefront of it. So why, in China's opinion, is it a good forum for AI regulation and probably safety and ethics? Is that what you mean, that they want so there are lots of aspects to governance of AI. So what particular aspects do you think UN would be suitable for?
The good news is you guys are gonna do a lunch or something, or like a postmortem all of this, so you'll have the opportunity to speak. Grace?
If you were, so question to all of you, if you were advising smaller countries or less resourced countries, what would you recommend to them? Like in terms of their engagement with the US and China, how do they do a little bit of both? Do they pick a side? I mean, I know what the US government or the Chinese government might recommend, but if you as experts would recommend an approach for them, what would you suggest?
Okay.
You could take Lebanon as an example, or maybe a country with a functioning government. Rwanda.
Jason, you talked about the new model of the non-monolithic state, and Carmen, you also addressed that. My question is, central state, local state, AI policy strategies, financing, and all of those kind of things. Is that different across different types of emerging critical technologies, or is it always the same playbook? So when it comes to doing this for AI versus semiconductors versus quantum, is it always like the same playbook in terms of like the Western perspective of having this is all the central state, it's all highly coordinated, but in fact, it's all actually done at the local state level with local companies, providers implementing things on a much more local level, including the incentives that you were talking about that local officials have to, appease the overlords at the central state.
Great, so we're out of time, but I want to make sure the panelists have a closing comment and lots of questions out there. We're going to go Jason, Carmen, and John. Jason.
Yeah, just very briefly. So regarding the UN question, I think China is utilizing all these different kind of platforms, and UN is part of it. And UN, China is stressing more on this both security, AI risks, and as well as AI as a development tool for human good and for the good of all countries. But for these less China regional and China bilateral talks and forums with like, for example, China-Africa forum in late August, they stressing a lot on this AI as a tool for development. So that's a quick response on that. I have no thoughts on this small country advice, but I'm happy to hear more and think about that more. In regarding to this across different AI applications, I think the key point is some of these are made by internet and platform companies, and for the consumer levels products, and some are more small unicorn companies and leading AI applications in small areas. And the former part of these are giving a lot of revenues to localities, to local governments. And so they would enjoy tax payments and as well as employment opportunities from these companies. So they will encourage things like that more.
Great, thanks, Jason. Carmen.
On the environment, yes, it's shifting some of the local competition. So regions that have hydropower or alternative sources are saying, hey, we're going to be leaders in this, and then they're trying to leverage that. But essentially, the same problems that the countries are facing. UN, I would just add to Jason's point that I think a part of the reason they chose it is because it's substanceless. I think that's one of the main problems of China's sort of international engagement on AI. It's very platitudey, but it doesn't have much substance. And to the extent that they are engaged internationally in more substantive ways, they've created other forums like the Belt and Road Initiative. They also like how the UN frustrates what the US does. They don't like the G7. They don't like the G20. They're in it, so they don't dislike it as much as the G7, but they like how the UN makes it difficult for the US to do things. Smaller countries, they should definitely play both sides. And then on the playbook, my impression is generally yes. Signal and then competition. I would say there's a spectrum. That dynamic is true in all of them. On the one hand, I think that's entirely that dynamic, and on the other extreme of the spectrum, you have like semiconductors where there's a lot more central government focus and investment, but there's still the sort of distributed dynamic. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Carmen. Please tell us how you really think about the UN. So, no, it's good. It's a great comment. We're close with you, John. You get the last points.
Okay, super. On interdependence and conflict, I would just say that you don't get to choose whether or not to have conflict. You get to choose how and where you're going to do it. So this isn't about whether we have peace and harmony with China or we have a big war, right? It's great power competition amid interdependence. And in an interdependent world, you can channel conflict in other ways that are maybe the lesser of 15 evils. Okay, small countries, yes, play both sides and do so discreetly and quietly. This is again a theme, like the gray zone is helpful, and secret, discreet, quiet diplomacy is helpful for explaining things to all sides. And then I think I will just maybe close with a quote from Georgia Tech alum Dmitry Alperovich. It's on cyber, but I think it applies to AI. He likes to say that the United States doesn't have a cyber problem, it has a China problem, and I think that's important to keep in mind here.
Great. That was great closing comment. Well, please, everybody, round of applause for a great